Hello, I'm Dr. Christian Lehman, and this is Reading the Victorian Novel. Today, we enter the penultimate installment of David Copperfield, installment 18, chapters 54 to 57. Topics that I'll discuss today are the chapter titles. I'll look at a couple of problematic sentences that Mr. Micawber makes that deal with colonialism, gender, and anti-Semitism, and I'll look at Traddles' growing thoughtfulness, then the Betsey husband plot, Tempest, the chapter title with some romantic inspiration, phrase very ill or dead, which will lead us to a letter of Dickens, and then Rosa's response to Steerforth's death, and then we'll end with the illustrations. The chapter titles of installment 18 are Mr. Micawber's Transactions, where we start to wrap up the Micawber plots. Tempest is the most important chapter of this installment, perhaps the most important chapter in the book in terms of Dickens's prose really becoming elevated. The New Wound and the Old is where we visit Rosa and Mrs. Steerforth, and then the Immigrants. The New Wound refers to the death of Steerforth. The Old Wound is Rosa's scar. And in the Immigrants, we send off Micawber's and Peggotty and Martha. So let's look here at some of these sentences from Mr. Micawber. "We might not," said Mr. Micawber, looking around the room as if it represented several hundred acres of highly cultivated land, "on the first responsibility becoming due, have been successful in our harvest, or we might not have gotten our harvest in. Labor, I believe, is sometimes difficult to obtain in that portion of our colonial possessions, where it will be our lot to combat with the teeming soil." So this is interesting to me because notice how Micawber says our colonial possessions. So he includes himself as a British person, and the possessions are his as a result. Of course, Micawber has frequently been hounded throughout the novel, not being invited into the society of the kind of British people. And so it's interesting that he still maintains that colonial imagination and sense of belonging. Shortly after, "Madam," he replied, "what I wish is to be perfectly businesslike and perfectly punctual. It is important to my sense of self-respect, besides being an example to my son, that these arrangements should be concluded as between man and man." Of course, Micawber is concluding these arrangements with Betsey, and so we have a little bit of that masculinizing on Betsey's part. And then lastly, "I propose," said Mr. Micawber, "bills, a convenience to the mercantile world, for which I believe we are originally indebted to the Jews, who appear to me to have had a devilish deal too much to do with them ever since, because they are negotiable." So notice that we have bills, convenience to their negotiable, but in the middle, Micawber has this aside about the stereotypes, the anti-Semitic stereotypes of the Jewish people and the world of money. Notice he uses alliteration in devilish deal to underscore this attitude. We have an interesting experience with Traddles where kind of David reports, "Really, I don't know about that," observed Traddles thoughtfully. "Many people can be very mean when they give their minds to it." Now, this is a really interesting sentence because it's David adding the idea of the thoughtfulness. And it reminds us that David has actually done remarkably little to conclude this plot of Wakefield, Uriah, Micawber. Traddles is the one that has been working on everything throughout this period of time. It is Traddles who is very capable. David has actually done a remarkably small amount of work when it comes to all of this. And I think it's important to underscore that. Traddles is actually a really capable lawyer. David, though, doesn't recognize this and only makes slow movements toward it. You'll remember in the previous installment that David had actually tried to go behind Traddles's back to make things easier while living with Dora, to form Dora's mind. A brief aside here, this is from a really remarkable Twitter presence, Dr. Bob Nicholson. He finds some really amazing materials in print archives. And here on the left, he found in 1892, Answers Magazine asked its readers to rank the most popular characters from the works of Charles Dickens. Pickwick and Sam from Pickwick Papers are on top, Little Nell from Old Curiosity Shop, and then both David and Mr. Micawber appear below that, followed by Nicholas Nickleby, Oliver Twist, and Captain Cuttle. Captain Cuttle is kind of an outlier there, but David and Micawber, I think today's readers would not put two of them even if they had to choose people from Copperfield at the top as being the most popular. 4 years earlier, Answers had run a competition wanting to know the most popular of Dickens's books. Pickwick again came out on top, but David Copperfield was second. And it's striking today to see maybe how low Bleak House is on that, and that little Dorrit doesn't even appear. So one of the strange things that happens in installment 18 is we wrap up the Betsey's husband plot. This has been working in the background. We've had a couple of mentions of it. Mr. Dick first brought it to our attention a long time ago. And then in London, David saw Betsey get into a cab with him. And now we learn more about it. We drove away out of town to the churchyard at Hornsey. Better here than in the streets, said my aunt. He was born here. We alighted and followed the plain coffin to a corner I remember well, where the service was read, consigning it to the dust. 36 years ago this day, my dear, said my aunt as we walked back to the chariot, I was married. God forgive us all. We took our seats in silence, and so she sat beside me for a long time, holding my hand. At length, she suddenly burst into tears and said, he was a fine-looking man when I married him, Trot, and he was sadly changed. So what we have with the Betsey's husband plot is an alternative to a number of the seduction scenes that we've had. So we have here a strong-willed woman, Betsey, marrying a man, primarily it seems from this, that he was fine looking. She, of course, got divorced and maintained the money, but so she was not a fallen woman. However, it was not a love marriage. It was a marriage based on superficial qualities. And we see this kind of carried out throughout the novel of all the different heterosexual pairings that have occurred. The thing, though, that I think this scene does the most is it underscores the fact that we don't see Dora's death and funeral. We see her death. Well, it's off stage. So I think we, again, have these weird ways in which we emphasize Dora by de-emphasizing what we've seen with her, because we have this completely like tertiary, even like 8th plot level, and we still spend several pages on it. All right, let's turn to the Tempest chapter. So this is one of the most remarkable chapters, I think, in all of Dickens, and it begins with David Copperfield being aware of how hard it's going to be to write it. And he actually is going to use a technique that emphasizes how difficult it is to write it down. And he's done it before. He did it way back in chapter 31, which is the chapter where we discovered that Emily has left with Steerforth. Back in that chapter, he had written, a dread falls on me here, a cloud is lowering on the distant towns, towards which I retraced my solitary steps. I fear to approach it. I cannot bear to think of what did come upon that memorable night, of what must come again if I go on. And now, as we enter chapter 55, he says, I now approach an event in my life, so indelible, so awful, so bound by an infinite variety of ties to all that has preceded it in these pages, that from the beginning of my narrative, I have seen it growing larger and larger as I advanced, like a great tower in a plain, and throwing its forecast shadow even on the incidents of my childish days. So David is setting us up for a really momentous chapter by first saying how difficult it is to write it, and then, as we'll see, really excelling himself with the prose. So let's look here at just an example paragraph of how he can do this. Each color here represents a different sentence. And so what you can even see before we read it is that they get longer, right? So it begins with kind of equally length sentences, then a little bit longer, and then really a phenomenal final sentence. And all of it is about the sea moving. And so I think what's happening here is with one sentence, the waves go up, with one, they recede. The tremendous sea itself, when I could find sufficient pause to look at it in the agitation of the blinding wind, the flying stones and sand, and the awful noise, confounded me. As the high watery walls came rolling in, and at their highest tumbled into surf, they looked as if the least would engulf the town. As a receding wave swept back with a hoarse roar, it seemed to scoop out deep caves in the beach, as if its purpose were to undermine the earth. When some white-headed billows thundered on and dashed themselves to pieces before they reached the land, every fragment of the late whole seemed possessed by the full might of its wrath, rushing to be gathered in the composition of another monster. Undulating hills were changed to valleys. Undulating valleys, with a solitary storm bird sometimes skimming through them, were lifted up to the hills. Masses of water shivered and shook the beach with a booming sound, Every shape tumultuously rolled on, as soon as made to change its shape and place, and beat another shape and place away. The ideal shore on the horizon with its towers and buildings rose and fell. The clouds fell fast and thick. I seemed to see a rending and upheaving of all nature. Notice that we have a kind of form of nature personified where David discusses the waves as being towers and buildings. And we're in a constant form of monstrosity, transformation that happens. There's a couple of things that I want to point out with this sentence. The first is this kind of chiasmus structure. Chiasmus is an ABBA structure. So here what we have is undulating hills were changed to valleys, undulating valleys with a solitary stormbird sometimes skimming through them were lifted up to hills. So hills, valleys, valleys, hills, A, B, B, A. I love this parenthetical about the stormbird skimming through. Dickens has tucked it away, or Copperfield has tucked it away into a parenthetical, almost as though it goes through that wave form itself. And then as the intensity picks up, Dickens starts using a lot of monosyllables in order to create an iambic rhythm. So if you just listen, the ideal shore on the horizon with its towers and buildings rose and fell. The clouds fell fast and thick. I seemed to see a rending and upheaving of all nature. One of the other things that makes this chapter so successful is a little bit of narrative prestidigitation. With one hand, Dickens distracts us with references to Ham, and this is going to hide the presence of Steerforth in the chapter. And so notice all the times that he says Ham's name in just 2 pages. Not finding Ham among the people whom this memorable wind felt an uneasiness in Ham's not being there. My uneasiness about Ham, least of all Ham Peggotty, who had been born to seafaring. The storm and my uneasiness regarding Ham were always in the foreground. So we readers are keened in to wait for Ham to appear, and his emphasis on his name really forefronts him. And so we are going to be blindsided later on by Steerforth. The way in which we're introduced to Steerforth adds even more emphasis, because what's going to happen is we're going to start with a full ship, and we're going to start plucking people off of the ship in order to get a lone survivor. So we begin. I plainly described her people at work with axes, especially one active figure with long curling hair, conspicuous among the rest, right? So people being an unnumbered plural, but one person does stand out. Then after the first big wave hits the boat, 4 men arose with the wreck out of the deep, clinging to the rigging of the remaining mast, uppermost the active figure with the curling hair. So we're keyed into this active figure, we're noticing his hair, but now we're counting down, we have 4. Again, we lost her, and again she rose, 2 men were gone. Now we have 2. We saw the cruel sail with blow on blow beat off the lower of the 2 men and fly up in triumph around the active figure left alone upon the mast. And now we've gotten rid of the last survivor, and so only we have Steerforth remaining, whose name we do not know. Steerforth has a remarkable red cap that stands out. The wreck, even to my unpracticed eye, was breaking up. I saw that she was parting in the middle, and that the life of the solitary man upon the mast hung by a thread. Still he clung to it. He had a singular red cap on, not like a sailor's cap, but a finer color. And as the few yielding planks between him and destruction rolled and bulged, and his anticipative death knell rung, he was seen by all of us to wave it. I saw him do it now and thought I was going distracted, when his action brought an old remembrance to my mind of a once dear friend. And that's going to be further evidence of it being Steerforth. Notice, though, that we're separating Steerforth from the other sailors, because it's not a sailor's cap he's wearing, it's a finer color, right? This idea that Steerforth's wealth sets him apart as a class. We have some interesting repetition with the word fragment that happens here as well. Around Ham, we get some eddying fragments, his death, around Ham's death. Some eddying fragments I saw in the sea. They drew him to my very feet, insensible, dead. He was carried to the nearest house, and no one preventing me now, I remained near him, busy, while every means of restoration were tried. But he had been beaten to death by the great wave, and his generous heart was stilled forever. And then with the death of Steerforth. But he led me to the shore, and on that part of it where she and I had looked for shells, 2 children, on that part of it, where some lighter fragments of the old boat, blown down last night, had been scattered by the wind, among the ruins of the home he had wronged, I saw him lying with his head upon his arm, as I had often seen him lie at school. So this raises one of the really interesting questions about this chapter. Why do Ham and Steerforth die at the same time? One of these answers was really well observed by some of my students, which is that people die in pairs in David Copperfield. So Clara and her unnamed son, David's brother, they died, Dora and Jip, and now Ham and Steerforth. So in a lot of ways, Ham and Steerforth have been triangulated through Emily in a lot of ways as well that we can kind of think about. But we get the emphasis on kind of Ham's generosity, right? Trying to save somebody, and Steerforth's Byronic flourish of his hat. Two very different personalities, but they meet the same fate. Notice the way in which we use dashes in both of these passages as well. So with Ham's death, we get the dash about his insensible, but then dead, right? We're eased into that death. And then we fragment David's memory in a lot of ways as he thinks back to his childhood with Emily and the lighter fragments of the old boat, right? That's the boathouse. That's the upside down boathouse in which they lived that blew down and was scattered. That's the also double ruins then of the home, right? Steerforth metaphorically ruining the home by seducing Emily, but then the physical destruction of the home as well with the storm. So even though Steerforth's name is not used, there's quite a bit of evidence that it is him, notably the curling hair. So this goes back to chapter 6. I heard that Miss Creakle was regarded by the school in general as being in love with Steerforth, and I am sure as I sat in the dark thinking of his nice voice and his fine face and his easy manner and his curling hair, I thought it very likely. And so the character had curling hair that's so noticeable, right? We saw figure with the curling hair, long curling hair. And then we get all that, the remembrance of the once dear friend, remembrance, and seen him lie at school. So the next chapter begins right away with Steerforth's name. So we're not left in too much anxiety about who this figure is, but we're told pretty quickly. So how does Dickens accomplish Tempest as a chapter, right? It really is a phenomenal progression of energies and tensions and escalation of prose and drama. So one thing that he does is he alters character perception. Throughout this chapter, David tells us many times that he has been sleepless. He tries going to sleep, but he can't sleep. He wakes up early. He drifts in and out. He stares at the fire. And so his remembrances then are rather through a mist. He alters our reading experience by using figurative language and poetic meter. He alters the reader's expectations, as I talked about, by emphasizing Ham's name. And then he uses that technique of having the waves knock off one survivor at a time. But there's another thing that he's up to, that Dickens is up to. And that is he's involved in a long tradition, well, a relatively recent tradition of painting shipwrecks. And what I want to suggest is that Dickens is trying to capture in prose what he sees in paintings. So he's attempting to write a romantic wreck. Here's a painting that many people probably know, The Raft of the Medusa by Theodore Géricault. Here, right, we see the survivors on the raft. We see the mast pointing up, right? It loves a triangular shape. This figure is waving this red cloth in the background. Then we have some Turners that we're going to look at. This is Turner's The Shipwreck. Here again, we see the ship on the side of a wave, some survivors pulling in, and just that dramatic triangles that we have. And lastly, this is Turner's Disaster at Sea. This depicts a shipwreck from the Andromeda off the coast of Bologna. And here the bodies writhe together as they fall, and we see the mast right here. There's another shipwreck painting that I won't be showing, but that Turner drew, which exhibits enslaved bodies having going overboard and also writhing in the water. This one actually depicts female prisoners who are dying there. So it's really, the content is really terrible, but the drama of the visual is, I think, what Dickens is trying to capture in prose. The next chapter immediately begins with the revelation of who this was, and David uses apostrophe, right? The address of a person that is not there to tell us who it was. No need, O Steerforth, to have said when we last spoke together in that hour, which I so little deemed to be our parting hour, no need to have said, think of me at my best. I had done that ever. And could I change now looking on this sight? So he will, right, in a lot of ways, David Copperfield is the love letter to James Steerforth in the same way that The Great Gatsby is Nick's love letter to Gatsby. So we now get a very weird callback, and it's going to get even weirder, don't worry. So in October of 1850, right, chapter 56, David tells Mrs. Steerforth about Steerforth's death. She says, my son is ill, very ill. You have seen him? I have. And then he looks across Mrs. Steerforth's shoulder to look at Rosa. I said, by the motion of my lips to Rosa, dead, right? So we have ill, very ill, dead. This is a callback way back to chapter 9, because, said she, this is when David learns of the death of his mother. Because, said she, I grieve to tell you that I hear this morning your mamma is very ill. She is very dangerously ill, she added. I knew all now. She is dead. So that's 1849. Then we have 1850. And a year later, Dickens is on April 14th, 1851. Dickens is going to write to his wife about the death of their daughter, whom they had named Dora, and who is only 8 months old. My dearest Kate, now observe, you must read this letter very slowly and carefully. If you have hurried on thus far without quite understanding, apprehending some bad news, I rely on your turning back and read again. Little Dora, without being in the least pain, is suddenly stricken ill. She awoke out of a sleep and was seen in one moment to be very ill. Mind, I will not deceive you, I think her very ill. There is nothing in her appearance but perfect rest. You would suppose her quietly asleep, but I am sure she is very ill, and I cannot encourage myself with much hope of her recovery. I do not, and why should I say I do to you, my dear? I do not think her recovery at all likely. You will not like to be away, I know, and I cannot reconcile it to myself to keep you away. Forster, with his usual affection for us, comes down to bring you this letter and to bring you home. But I cannot close it without putting the strongest entreaty and injunction upon you to come with perfect composure, to remember what I have often told you, that we never can expect to be exempt, as to our many children, from the afflictions of other parents. And that if, when you come, I should even have to say to you, our little baby is dead, you are to do your duty to rest and to show yourself worthy of the great trust you hold in them. If you will read this steadily, I have perfect confidence in your doing what is right. Ever affectionately, Charles Dickens. So right here, Dickens actually uses the technique that he had invented in his novel to describe the death of his own Dora. Very ill, dead. Let's look now at Rosa's response to Steerforth's death. And it's quite striking. She says, I descended, as I might have known I should, but that he fascinated me with his boyish courtship into a doll, a trifle for the occupation of an idle hour, to be dropped and taken up and trifled with, as the inconstant humor took him. When he grew weary, I grew weary. As his fancy died out, I would no more have tried to strengthen any power I had than I would have married him on his being forced to take me for his wife. We fell away from one another without a word. Perhaps you saw it and were not sorry. Since then, I have been a mere disfigured piece of furniture between you both, having no eyes, no ears, no feelings, no remembrances. Moan for what you made him, not for your love. I tell you that the time was when I loved him better than you ever did. So the whole dynamic with Rosa and Mrs. Steerforth is marvelous. It's nuanced, it's problematic, it's psychologically complex. But in this moment, we have even more insight into Rosa's obsession, love, broken heart, and Steerforth's abuse of her, right? Steerforth essentially did the same thing with Rosa when he was much younger that he does with Emily. He boyishly courts her, turns her into a doll. And the trifle, notice that trifle is so striking after last week's reference to trifles are the things that make up life. This reference to, I would not have married him as if he were forced, right? This is what happens in some plots if a woman gets pregnant from a man during a seduction. So throughout, Rosa is wrestling. Rosa probably has one of the most complex inner lives, and we're allowed only glimpses of it when intense emotion takes over. We have just a brief last bit, this idea of the last sight of the Immigrant Boat, where there's a little bit of conflation between she being a boat, but then also not being able to see Emily, which calls back a reference to when Steerforth bought a boat named Emily. So here are the illustrations. The first one is I am the bearer of evil tidings. Here we have David, two illustrations of horses, one standing still, one kind of moving to the side. Rosa staring at David. Mrs. Steerforth maybe side-eyeing David or the terrier. Across the walls, we have the pistols, the fishnets, various signs of Steerforth's boyhood. And one of the more interesting aspects, I think, though, is this pen and ink well, and then the book at the bottom, right? It's kind of a triangulation next to David of his whole career and of this book that we're reading. The dog is not in the text, but it creates a really strong contrast to the last illustration, which was David next to Jip looking up the last time. Here as well, we have an empty chair and a spool of thread unspooling. Kind of the absent presences that we note throughout the novel, especially in the illustrations. And then we've seen unspooling thread before to mean kind of disorder, but here it maybe strongly reminds us of the thread upon which Steerforth's life hung. The other illustration is the emigrants, and this we have David, Peggotty, and Mr. Micawber kind of present in the center, this little triangulation happening there. And then just a crowd scene of different approaches to what's going to happen in the future. This loving family right here, this kind of sorrowful woman maybe being comforted, this other sorrowful woman, this child curiously playing with a bird cage, a boy that is probably Wilkins, young Micawber, and a solitary figure in bathed in light, looking out to the future. I think there's a strong case for this being Emily, maybe Martha, and then this figure kind of turned away, perhaps being Agnes visiting the boat. There's a last image that I wanted to share, which is a famous painting from 2 years after Copperfield, Ford Madox Brown's The Last of England. Here we see an emigration boat departing the cliffs of Dover in the background. They stare straight out at us. Here's a curious girl with her green apple. There's male figures smoking the cabbages. But the striking thing is that this woman here has a small child. So ambiguous in terms of its hopes or potentials with a new land. And with that, that brings to a close installment 18. And we just have one more installment left, the double number, 19 and 20.